Hello, good evening, and welcome to Prague Chattery 777. Well, it's late at night, it is an October's Eve, it's blustery outside, and I'm very tired, and so obviously we must be talking about Jethro Tull. Like I said in the intro, this is one of my favorite bands. They're not really, they're more associated with the Prague thing than they were an active part of it. They spent a couple of years later where they kind of were actively doing the crazy progressive thing, but then they kind of they went in a different direction. But they're always they were always very ambitious and very creative and very interesting. And also really the vision of Ian Anderson. Jethro Tull was less of a obviously there's different lineups of the band, but they were less of a band thing and more Ian Anderson's band, and the music that Jethro Tull made it was Ian's vision. And the one exception, I think, probably the one exception in the whole catalog is the debut album, This Was, which features guitar player Mick Abrahams, the only album to feature Mick Abrahams. He's a very bluesy guitar player, and thus the album has a very bluesy kind of feel to it. Basically, they were just a blues band at this point. But besides being a guitar player, Mick Abrahams is also a writer, and he contributed a lot of the music on this album. So this is also, this is the one album where, the vision, it is more of a band. It is more Jethro Tull the band, and not, Ian Anderson's thing. Obviously, when we talk about Jethro Tull, the stuff that we love is the stuff that was done under Ian's command. So, doesn't necessarily make it essential. In fact, this is not essential at all, really. It's an interesting artifact. It features Ian Anderson on guitar, flute. Maybe I don't even think he plays guitar. Actually, there's no acoustic guitar by Anderson on this. I don't think. But he sings, he plays flute, and a lot of harmonica on this record. Mick Abrahams, like I said, he's the guitar player, one of the two writers, and great blues guitar player. He's very rooted in the blues, and not only are the songs that he writes very bluesy, but I mean his contributions in general as a player are super bluesy. Then we get Clive Bunker over here on the drums. He's a really underrated drummer, actually, and he was with Jethro Tull for 4 albums. He's the drummer on Aqualung, the big famous one. And like I said, he's quite an underrated drummer. He kind of got out of the scene, out of the music scene after Jethro Tull. And I feel if he stuck with it a little bit more, he may have been a little more highly regarded later on. They would later go on to get Barrymore Barlow on the drums for the 70s, the bulk of the 70s, and he's another very underrated drummer. I think he's a fantastic drummer, and he had the big exposure of a famous band. And the last, but certainly not least, on this album we get Glenn Cornick on the bass, who is quite a good bass player, and again, I think he's overshadowed by some of the other lineups of Jethro Tull. But like I said, this debut album is by Jethro Tull the Blues Band, and this is just how they were surviving in London at the time. Originally, the band was formed in Blackpool with some of Ian Anderson's school chums, and they, a very long, complicated story short, they had a band together that went by various different names. They went to London to try and make it. They didn't make it right away, and there was some lineup changes, and basically all of his school friends from Blackpool in England went back home, and the musicians that Anderson was left with were the musicians that ended up on this record. And they made a living by playing these kind of bluesy songs, and the music is played very well, but it's certainly not typical Jethro Tull. I get a nice little gatefold here, nice early shot of the band. Obviously, Anderson is famous for his flute playing. I think he'd been playing the flute about 2 weeks or something before this was recorded. And he always kind of had a weirdo, a hack technique for the bulk of his career. I mean, he never actually properly learned to play the flute until the 90s. It was about 30 years, close to 30 years after this before he started, properly playing the flute. But his DIY technique, learning as you go, this album is him learning the flute, basically. You see it. That DIY style, that technique gave him a really, really good style. And, I'm obviously glad that later on in the 90s he, took his flute playing to another level, but, it was right for Jethro Tull at the time. So yeah, let's talk about the tracks. It's not, like I said, it's not an essential album, but we're talking about it. Side 1, we get My Sunday Feeling, the first Jethro Tull song we ever hear. That's a Ian Anderson song. Right away, I mean, you get the bluesiness. It's got that great guitar riff, and the flute does the call and response thing. Again, it's one of the first, hadn't been playing flute 2 months. I'm quite certain that's true. I hope it's true, because I just said it. And yeah, it's kind of a classic Jethro Tull track that was played famously at the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970. They opened with My Sunday Feeling. We're introduced to Ian Anderson, the vocalist, and he's very modest about his vocals. He says, "Well, I was always the vocalist because I was the only one in the band. I was just better than the other guys in the band." But I think he's actually a tremendous singer. He doesn't have the greatest technique. But, I mean, particularly in the mid-70s, his voice is one of my favorite voices, actually, one of my favorite singers. And again, it's not technical ability, it's just the way it sounds. And particularly all over this album, but we get some of his quirkiness on My Sunday Feeling. He hasn't really found himself as a singer on this album. He's basically trying to impersonate blues singers, so he's, My Sunday Feeling coming down over me. That was a weak impersonation of Ian Anderson impersonating blues singers. But that's kind of what he's doing. He hasn't found his own voice yet. But it's entertaining and good. My Sunday Feeling is good. Track 2 is Someday the Sun Won't Shine for You. This is funny. It's another Anderson song, but it just seems so pure bluesy. It's super bluesy. I get a lot of nice harmonica. Great harmonica playing, and he's kind of underrated as that. Obviously, he was more attracted to the flute because he could do funny things on stage with it and whatnot, and it was a better prop for him, and he's probably just more interested in it. But he is a good harp player. He blows a good harp. Track 3 is Beggar's Farm. This is the only song, I believe, the only song on this album anyway. I think there might be some other tracks. It's written to and credited to Anderson and Abrahams. And it's a cool song. It's again very bluesy. It's kind of got that just like bluesy guitar licks. This is kind of the main riff, I guess, but it feels more like a lick. It kind of sneaks through it. Nothing to write home about, but there's some good guitar playing in there. Number 4 is Move On Alone. It's a nice bouncy little number. Nice little horn section. I believe was arranged by David Palmer, who would arrange lots of orchestral bits for the band and later join the band. This is his first contribution, I think, is on Move On Alone. We get the nice horns. That's nice. Track 5. This is one of the highlights on the first side is Serenade to a Cuckoo, the Roland Kirk cover. A great little bit of jazz, and they do a pretty convincing job of it. Although they would do better things very soon. That's the end of side 1. We flip side 2. We get Dharma For One. This is kind of the one indicator of where they were going after this. It got much better later on. This is just an instrumental version, and there's some kind of crazy madness. Later on, Anderson would throw on some vocals to it, and there was a big Clive Bunker drum solo, which is super cool, as heard on Living in the Past. And there's some videos of it as well. Number 2 of side 2, It's Breaking Me Up, another Anderson song. Again, it's just kind of your typical blues, more harp. It's very bluesy. Uh, there's there's nothing distinct about what they're doing just yet. Although track 3, Cat Squirrel, this is distinct. It's a traditional old blues song. Again, just kind of guitar licks in that. Instrumental, and it's really Mick Abraham's showcase. This is the peak of his recorded output in Jethro Tull is on Cat Squirrel. And even though he didn't actually write the song, Abrahams did arrange it, and it's a great little showcase for him, and a highlight of the album, really, definitely. One of the album highlights, Cat Squirrel. Track 4 of side 2. This is the classic of the album. I'm not. Again, I throw the word classic around an awful lot. It kind of softens its meaning, but "Song for Jeffrey" is quite good. It's famous. It's famous that for being played at the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus, the thing that they did, and of course they just mimed it. But yeah, it's a really, really good song. It's bluesy, but it's kind of an indicator of where they were going. There's a few kind of interesting arrangement changes that kind of pop up in the song. And who is the Jeffrey they're talking about? A character that we will get more acquainted with later on. Yeah, what else can be said? There's some great harp on "Song for Jeffrey." I love the intro. I love the flute at the beginning and the bass. Great, and yeah, definitely this is probably the biggest indicator of where they were going, and probably the only song on the album that doesn't feel out of place when you throw it with other Tull songs. I might be wrong. I'm not sure. But it's good. "Song for Jeffrey," probably the best on the album. I'll go ahead and say it. And it's really the closer of the album because track 5, "Round," is just this minute or so of kind of light smoky bar jazz tones. Reminds me, I say smoky bars, it just reminds me of a smoky bar in the '60s and some light jazz playing. Yeah, it's cool. It's a nice little way to round the album out. See what I did there? Round the album out. So yeah, it was called "This Was" because by the time this was released, I believe Mick Abrahams was either pretty much out of the band or he was out of the band. Because there was a creative rift between Anderson and Abrahams. Obviously, Abrahams is the blues purist, and Anderson, in his words, said he didn't want to play the blues anymore because he was the wrong color. Very eloquent. Ian Anderson is a very eloquent fellow. And so, yeah, at that point, when Mick Abrahams was out, the band became Ian Anderson's, and Abrahams was replaced by one Martin Lancelot Barr, who would be the longest serving member of Jethro Tull, other than Anderson, of course. And from here, they essentially abandoned the blues altogether and sought out new, exciting paths for themselves, and that's probably why they're considered part of that prog rock thing. But I've probably talked too long about this. It's a good album. It's not essential. It's an artifact, historical artifact. Jethro Tull, the blues band before it was Ian Anderson's band. It was a band, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's better than the other stuff, because there's some great stuff to come. More Tull later. We'll be talking about Stand Up. We'll see you then.